Welcome to Western Truth TV and Western Truth Radio. Frederick Flanagan here with my very first official broadcast. I do hope you enjoy, find it thought-provoking, and leave your feedback in the comments. Tonight's broadcast is in regards to Australia's ongoing debate on the voice to Parliament for First Nations people in order to preserve and defend Aboriginal cultural diversity. We must vote no to assimilation and to the so-called voice to Parliament. Throughout history, assimilation policies have had a profound impact on the cultural identity and well-being of Aboriginal people in Australia. Here we will delve into the historical context and explore consequences of these policies on the Aboriginal community. By understanding the effects of assimilation, we can better comprehend why voting no to a voice to Parliament for so-called First Nations people is crucial for preserving their culture and way of life. The assimilation policies implemented in Australia during the late 1930s and early 1950s sought to absorb Aboriginal people into the wider population and strip them of their cultural heritage. Policies were initially designed to eradicate Aboriginal culture by forcibly removing children from their families, a practice commonly known as the stolen generations. This process assimilates Aboriginal people into white society, further marginalizing their cultural practices, traditions. Continued assimilation. While the term assimilation has gradually been replaced by concept of representation in newer laws, the underlying goal remains the same: Aboriginal culture. The deceptive shift in language and laws seeks to manipulate both Aboriginal people and Australians into accepting the notion of assimilation under the guise of by framing Aboriginal people as First Nations people and associating them with a common nation state. The Australian state further undermines their cultural identity, impact on cultural identity and well-being. Assimilation policies have had a devastating impact on the cultural identity and well-being of Aboriginal people. The forced separation from their families, communities, and ancestral lands has resulted in the loss of language, traditions, and customs that are integral to their cultural identity. Trauma experienced by the stolen generations continues to reverberate through subsequent generations, leading to a disconnection from cultural roots and a sense of loss. The cultural erosion caused by assimilation policies has also contributed to the marginalization, discrimination faced by Aboriginal people in contemporary society. By attempting to assimilate into a foreign culture, these policies have perpetuated a cycle of disadvantage and inequality. Loss of cultural pride and self-esteem has had profound effects on the mental and emotional well-being of Aboriginal individuals and communities. Preserving cultural identity, voting yes for a voice to Parliament for First Nations people would only perpetuate the assimilation podcast by further integrating Aboriginal people into the Australian state, which is incongruent with their beliefs and way of life. Their cultural identity and well-being would be further compromised. It is essential to recognize that supporting such a proposal would be a betrayal of the struggles and injustices faced by Aboriginal people. The impact of assimilation on the cultural identity and well-being of Aboriginal people in Australia cannot be understated. These policies have resulted in the loss of language, traditions, and a sense of Aboriginal individuals and communities. Voting no to a voice to Parliament for First Nation people is crucial in order to protect their cultural heritage and ensure a future where culture can thrive. It is our responsibility to learn from the mistakes of the past towards reconciliation and the preservation of Aboriginal culture. The historical and cultural significance of Aboriginal languages in Australia, the rich and diverse. Aboriginal languages of Australia hold immense historical and cultural significance. These languages have been passed down through generations, serving as a vital means of communication. expression and connection to the land. However, the devastating impact of assimilation policies resulted in the loss of many Aboriginal languages, severely impacting the Aboriginal community. Importance of language in Aboriginal culture. Aboriginal languages are not merely a tool for communication. They are deeply intertwined with the cultural identity and knowledge system of Aboriginal communities. These languages encapsulate unique perspectives encompassing traditional stories, spiritual beliefs, and cultural practices. They passing down cultural heritage, ensuring the continuity of traditions, and strengthening community bonds. The impact of assimilation policies, in the past sought to erode their cultural identity and forcibly integrate them into the dominant white society. One of the most devastating consequences of these policies was the suppression, abandonment of Aboriginal languages. Under the guise of assimilation, forcibly removed from their families and sent to institutions where their language and culture actively suppressed. This deliberate effort to sever the connection between their cultural heritage resulted in the loss of language proficiency, intergenerational transmission of language knowledge, loss of language and cultural disconnection, the loss of Aboriginal languages due to assimilation policies has had profound consequences for the Aboriginal community. Language is not only a means of communication, but also a carrier of knowledge, values, and traditions. When a language is lost, a significant part of a community cultural identity is also lost. The erosion of Aboriginal languages has led to a disconnection from ancestral lands, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs. It has severed the link between generations, hindering the transmission of cultural knowledge from elders to younger community members. The loss of language and cultural disconnection has resulted in a sense of loss, identity crisis, weakening of community cohesion. Efforts for language revitalization, despite the immense caused by assimilation policies. There have been ongoing efforts to revitalize and preserve Aboriginal languages, recognizing the importance of language and cultural preservation. Aboriginal communities. Linguists and language experts have collaborated to document and revive endangered languages. Language revitalization programs focus on reclaiming and promoting Aboriginal languages, community-led initiatives, language classes immersion programs, and the development of language resources. These efforts aim to empower Aboriginal communities to reclaim their cultural heritage and strengthen their cultural identity. The historical and cultural significance of Aboriginal languages in Australia cannot be overstated. The loss of these languages due to assimilation policies has had a profound impact on the Aboriginal community, resulting in a disconnection from cultural heritage and a weakening of community bonds. Efforts to revitalize, preserve Aboriginal languages are crucial in reclaiming cultural identity and ensure these invaluable linguistic treasures. It is imperative that we recognize the importance of these languages and support initiatives that empower Aboriginal communities to reclaim and their linguistic and cultural heritage. Task added write a 500-word section discussing the impact of assimilation policies on the cultural practices and traditions of the Aboriginal community in Australia. The impact of assimilation policies on Aboriginal cultural practices and traditions. The history of policies toward the Aboriginal people in Australia has been marked by a systematic attempt to assimilate them in the wider population. These assimilation policies, which began in 1937 and continued through the rebranding in 1951, have had a profound impact on the cultural practices and traditions of Aboriginal community. Assimilation policies of 1937 and 1951, the assimilation policies of 1937 and 1951 were designed to erode the Aboriginal culture and way of life from their families and assimilating them into white society. The goal was to dilute Aboriginal heritage and replace it with the dominant white culture. This policy was based on the belief that Aboriginal people who were not of full blood should be absorbed into the wider population, continuation of assimilation through subtle means. While the explicit policies of assimilation have changed over time, the underlying goal of eradicating Aboriginal culture has remained the same. Language and laws surrounding assimilation have been updated and altered, but the outcome remains consistent. The subtle and deceptive means employed today aim to achieve the same outcome as the policies of the past. The assimilation and eradication, restoration. From assimilation to representation, the term assimilation gradually evolved in language and new laws to that of representation. However, this so-called representation is in fact a form of eradicating Aboriginal culture and way of life. The representation is within the Australian state and the Australian nation, both concepts that Aboriginal people did not have or believe in, using the term First Nations people and officially calling them such. It is a further assimilation that manipulates both Aboriginal people and Australians into accepting a term that seeks to erase Aboriginal culture and various cultures. The proposed voice to Parliament, the coffin of assimilation, is the proposed voice to Parliament for so-called First Nations. Supporting this proposal is supporting the total assimilation and eradication of Aboriginal peoples, their culture and their way of life. It pushes them further into the Australian state, a state antithetical to their beliefs, culture and way of life. Voting yes for a voice to Parliament for First Nations people is a continuation of the Australian state's original policy of assimilation. It is important to question whether assimilation policies of the past aligns with our values and conscience. If we oppose these policies in the past, how can we, in good conscience, support this one? By doing so, we are not a voice of support for Aboriginal people and culture. We are a voice that seeks to end it once and for all. Impact of assimilation policies on the cultural practices and traditions of the Aboriginal community in Australia has been devastating. The forced removal of children from their families and the ongoing attempts to erase their culture have resulted in the loss of language, customs, and tradition knowledge. It is crucial that we recognize the historical injustices and work towards and preservation of Aboriginal culture. And in doing this, we must not only vote no to the voice of assimilation, we must rethink our entire approach to Aboriginal people, all of the Australian state policies forced upon them, and repeal any and all existing policies of eradication and assimilation. Thank you very much for listening. If you have got to the end of my presentation on this subject, I would very much appreciate your feedback in the comments. This is Frederick Flanagan, Chief Broadcaster for Western Truth TV and Western Truth Radio, signing off. Have a great night, friends. This is Frederick Flanagan, Chief Broadcaster for Western Truth TV and Western Truth Radio, signing off. Have a great night, my friends.